Jedi. Ahsoka is Jedi.
Hey, welcome back to ScreenCrush. I'm Ryan, and this is all of the Easter eggs, references, and little things that you might have missed in Star Wars Tales of the Jedi. I love this show. I'm so happy it's not just random Jedi stories. These actually form an intricate arc to show the special bond between a master and their apprentice. See, Jedi are forbidden to have families or even attachments, so the closest people they have are their masters and Padawans. This show shows us a succession of masters, beginning with Dooku and ending with Ahsoka, that eventually ended the Jedi Order and created a new path forward for the galaxy. And you know what? It's no surprise that the story begins and ends with Ahsoka Tano. She is Dave Filoni's greatest creation, the true heart of the Clone Wars, and the true example of how the Jedi can adapt into a greater force for good. Episode 1 focuses on baby Ahsoka, and it's called Life and Death. It begins with a new life, her being born, and nearly features her death. But the episode is about learning the lesson that life and death are both connected through the Force. So let's break this down. It's fitting that the series begins on a shot of stars. After all, this is how Star Wars always begins. And notice we only hear the sounds of nature, of life in the forest, until this. Newborn Ahsoka Tano is the first sound in this series. So this takes place in 36 BBY, or before the Battle of Yavin. We know this because Ahsoka was 14 in the Clone Wars movie, which is set in 22 BBY.
Oh, okay, yeah, interesting.
So I don't think this story is the first chronologically in this series, but beginning with a birth does create a cool bookend for the series. This is on planet Sheely, and you might think that this is a primitive planet since these people live in a small village, but they do have droids and advanced technology. They just prefer a simple country way of life. Now this makes sense with the history of the Togruta, that's Ahsoka's people. They resisted joining the Republic for hundreds of years because they were so independent.
Hey, why does Ahsoka only got 2 little dots in her face when she's born? Where are her face markings? Are they painted? Does she paint them on?
Well, that's a great question, Doug. See, the Togruta's face markings are all natural, and they grow as they age. So they're born with minimal markings. This is why they're all unique, and why Ahsoka has the same markings when she's on the run from the Empire. Because otherwise, when she was on the run, she would have changed them. Now, after Ahsoka is born, a wise old woman from her village named Gantika enters to bless the child. Gantika is more attuned with spirituality, traditions, and the outside world than the rest of the village. When Ahsoka is just a year old, her mother takes her on her first traditional hunt.
What good's a baby gonna be on a hunt? Unless it's bait.
Ooh, harsh. Well, look, many native tribes have similar traditions, where a young person goes on their first hunt as a rite of passage. Heck, even modern-day deer hunters do this. But in Ahsoka's case, this is about introducing her to the cycle of life and death. She needs to learn about death in order to respect life. The Togrutans have a tradition of hunting beasts and turning their teeth into headdresses. Both Shakti and Ahsoka wore similar headdresses like these, and so do the villagers in this episode. Gantika also has teeth around her sleeves and on her shoulders. She has seen many hunts. And guys, I kind of think the Togruta women do all the hunting in their culture. Before Ahsoka leaves, Gantika anoints her head with oil and paint. And again, this is a tradition in many native cultures. A Cherokee hunter would fast and then cook a meal and spread ashes from the fire across his chest. And many cultures around the world would paint themselves with protective markings before battle, like Pawnee scouts who painted their faces white to symbolize wolves.
Or Arnold Schwarzenegger covering himself in mud to hunt the predator.
Kind of like that, yes. And we see in this episode that for the Togruta, this hunt is a spiritual experience.
It is custom.
In old days, old ways for the old. Not you, Bhavti. Not yet.
The Togrutas seem to be more influenced by Asian culture, especially the Japanese. You can see this in their architecture and in the music of this episode. I love this detail because the Ahsoka episode of The Mandalorian was a straight-up homage to Kurosawa samurai films. Also, it looks like Gantika is feeding an animal similar to a lothcat. Like, look, I know this is not a lothcat, not on Lothal. It's more like a space raccoon, but the design and principles of these two animals are the same. On the hunt, her mom gives her a whole circle of life talk.
Everywhere there is life. Value it. Honor it.
Afterwards, her mother kills a space deer. The lesson here is that death makes life important.
You must face death, Ahsoka. Do not fear it.
And she is showing her daughter that taking a life is something special and rare, and that there is actually good to be found in death. This is to underscore how life recreates itself. They also hit these space dandelions, which spread their seeds to grow more plants, all part of the same lesson. This lesson about life, death, and rebirth is very similar to the lessons of the Force.
Life. Death and decay. That feeds new life.
Now, of course, any lesson about the circle of life always has to remind us that
there's always a bigger fish.
A space saber-toothed tiger stalks Pav-T in the same field where she just stalked a space deer. How easily the hunter becomes the hunted.
Yeah, like that movie The Predator. Or like that other movie where those rich guys paid money to hunt Ice-T, but then he started hunting them.
Exactly like that. Deep cut reference. High five. So the townspeople try to help, but the tiger takes Ahsoka away to its den where it can eat the baby in peace.
Oh no, not the baby.
Won't somebody please think of the children?
And now this is interesting. Ahsoka touches the tiger and makes a connection to it through the Force. Now, babies can't use the Force at will. They have a Force sensitivity, but they have to be trained over many years to use it. But I bet that babies are actually more attuned to certain aspects of the Force, like mentally connecting their emotions to another simple mind, like the mind of an animal. Now, after Pav-T's kill, she makes a point of saying,
I shall carry you.
And in the end, Ahsoka is carried by another hunter, the tiger. This thematically connects the tiger and the mother. Both teach Ahsoka a lesson. Her mother teaches her to have a connection to death, while the tiger gives her her first connection to life through the Force. The townspeople think this is a miracle, but Gantika explains.
Jedi.
Now, 2 years after this, Ahsoka would be discovered by Plo Koon and taken to the Jedi Order, and years later, she would become the Padawan of Anakin Skywalker. But this episode gives us an insight as to why a family would let their child be raised by the Jedi. They see that Ahsoka is different and know that she could do some good for the galaxy by living a life in the service of others, a life to serve the Force. This is a great introduction to the series and to the simplicity of the Jedi's mission. But the following episodes show us how, as they grow up, the Jedi's mission becomes less clear. Now let's move on to episode 2, Justice. The core of this series is showing Dooku's fall from grace, and this episode tries to shed some light on why he became disillusioned by the institution and turned to Sidious. So let me give you a little bit of backstory on Dooku that helps to frame this episode just a bit. The audio novel Dooku, Jedi Lost fills in a lot of his backstory and why he turned away from the Order. Basically, he was born to a wealthy family and raised from a young age by the Jedi, but he also kept an attachment to his family and stayed close to his sister. His best friend was a Jedi Master named Sifo Dyas, more on him in a second, and on one mission with him, Dooku actually used Force lightning like way before he turned to the Sith. So the dark side had actually always been creeping up on him for years, and this episode takes place several years after that event. I'm guessing about 20 years before the Phantom Menace at least. So it's very cool to see a young Qui-Gon Jinn in this episode. He's voiced by Corey Burton, the same guy that voices Cad Bane.
You've got a deal.
When the two of them land on this planet, we think that it's been through a war. I love the details in this place, how it looks like this European town that they drew a perfect version of, but then just went through and like covered it with ash. It's gray, there's flies everywhere. This droid can barely lift this sickly looking hay bale into a wagon, which is actually being pulled by an R4 unit, like the wagon that we saw in Navarro in The Mandalorian. So we're meant to think that this devastation is from war, but it's actually from neglect. This is from a greedy politician concentrating wealth in the cities and doing nothing to help the working man. As they're walking into the village, we see the silhouettes of the kidnappers that we meet later, including a Rodian-like Greedo and an Arcona, and this is actually the first species that we saw in the Mos Eisley Cantina. Inside the bar, notice that the taps look like the heads of the IG assassin droids. These are also the same taps that we originally saw in the Cantina in Mos Eisley, but also in Sid's place in the Bad Batch. In the bar, we also see a Twi'lek and an Aqualish like this guy. Shout out real quick to the lighting on Dooku at this table. Animation has come such a long way since 2008. He says,
"Allow me to make my intentions clear.
So it's important to note that early in the episode, he's already using the threat of violence to get what he wants. They take him to the barn where the Senator's son is being held, and the droid guardian is a binary load lifter, like 3PO mentioned in A New Hope.
My first job was programming binary load lifters.
Now, the longer Qui-Gon and Dooku stay on the planet, the more complicated this situation gets. They start to see that the real enemy here aren't the kidnappers, it's an officer of the Republic Senate, the very institution that they serve. And this is getting to a real ethics versus morality conversation. Ethically, they are bound to serve the institution, but morally, they side with these people. This episode shows what happens when institutions become corrupt. People feel like they can no longer believe in those institutions, and they create their own brand of law and order.
Say what now?
Like in Joker.
Oh, okay, angry clown people, got it.
Then the senators showed up with the authorities, and I loved their designs. First of all, the bright blue and gold is a stark contrast to this gray, ashen environment, and we immediately get that these guys are from money. And the helmets themselves are designed to mimic ancient Persian or Turkish helmets with these signature cone shapes. They're kind of like the samurai helmets in A New Hope, both familiar and new. And Kevin Kiner's score is unreal in this episode.
Step aside, Jedi.
It's like this constant feeling that something very bad is going to happen any minute now. And then something bad really happens. The senator says the Jedi serve the Republic, and Dooku responds with,
We serve the people of this republic.
and actually this is a point that he gets over Obi-Wan, who years later said,
Anakin, my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy!
his allegiance should have been to the Force, or to the people. See, the Jedi fell because they put too much faith in institutions and not enough faith in the Force. This is also neatly setting up Dooku's disillusionment with the Jedi Order that we're going to talk about later on. Now notice that Dooku is the first to draw here, always a sign of someone who's more open to falling to the dark side. He has a similar curved saber to the one he used in Attack of the Clones. Now the saber is for more of a fencing style of combat, because Dooku practiced this form too, also called Makashi. It's more of a classical, elegant style of combat that even predates blasters. And of course, Qui-Gon has his signature green saber that he used in The Phantom Menace. Notice in this face-off that the Senator's people all have these nice automatic military rifles, but the kidnappers all have regular rifles, weapons they probably use for hunting. To show how poor these people are, notice you can see the ribs showing on this dog.
What?
You're not going to say anything about the dog?
It's a skinny dog, man. It happens.
All right. The senator tries to flex his power, which angers Dooku and makes him respond in kind.
I will destroy this town and make an example of it.
And then he pulls the old dark side standby, the Force choke. Qui-Gon finds a diplomatic solution by releasing the boy, just as Dooku is going to eradicate political corruption the old-fashioned way by assassination. Again, this fits in with how the Jedi spoke of Dooku even years after he left the Order.
He is a political idealist, not a murderer.
So when the kid leaves with his dad in the speeder, notice that there is an RA-7 droid in the passenger seat like we first saw in the Sandcrawler in A New Hope. When Dooku thanks Qui-Gon, he says,
Just thinking in the moment, Master.
Now, years later, Qui-Gon will come to believe in the power of the living Force, and he believes that the Jedi need to be more aware of the will of the Force that's actually around them. Basically, his first lesson to Obi-Wan in the movies.
But not at the expense of the moment. Be mindful of the living Force, young Padawan.
And Dooku ends the episode by saying,
You're a much wiser man than I, Qui-Gon Jinn.
Which of course Qui-Gon will echo to Obi-Wan years later.
And you're a much wiser man than I am.
Now the movies do a good job of setting up that Dooku's rebelliousness was passed down the line of Padawans. Qui-Gon broke with the Council, Obi-Wan defied the Council to train Anakin, and Anakin turned to the dark side, and Ahsoka flat out left the Order. And that entire pattern starts right here. Now after these events, Dooku's best friend Sifo-Dyas had a vision of a great conflict, and he realized that the Republic would need a clone army to win this coming war, like Aegon's prophecy, but for Star Wars. The Jedi Council ignored him, so Sifo-Dyas took the initiative of hiring the Kaminoans to clone the army all by himself. But then Dooku turned on his best friend and hired the Pikes to shoot down his ship, so he and Sidious could take over controlling this clone army and reprogram the clones to carry out Order 66. Also, just after the events of Episode 4, Dooku leaves the Jedi Order to take over his family's position as the leader of Serrano, which is why he's called Count Dooku in the movies. So, on to Episode 3, Choices. I love how we're slowly seeing the foundation of Dooku's turn being built up. It all pairs really well with that audio novel that I talked about earlier. Dooku and Mace Windu are investigating the death of Master Khatri, who is a Myrialon like Luminara Unduli. Dooku and Windu are perfect for a buddy cop story here because they have very different viewpoints. Dooku is a little bit more emotional. Remember, he even kept in touch with his family, which is a no-no because it creates attachments. Whereas Windu is way more by the book, the kind of guy who always gets promoted.
Your devotion to rules is sometimes inspiring and sometimes maddening.
But their friendship is very evident here, and we can see why years later Mace Windu spoke so highly of Dooku.
Count Dooku was once a Jedi. He couldn't assassinate anyone. It's not in his character.
They're going to planet Raxus, which we first saw in the Clone Wars. It became the second capital of the Confederacy after Geonosis. Then, in the Bad Batch episode Common Ground, we saw the Empire exert full control over its people and economy. Now, it's not too long before Dooku realizes that something's fishy going on Raxus, and he takes the initiative to uncover the murder of a Jedi. This line,
For a Jedi to succumb to a surprise attack is rare. Unless that attack is from someone one would trust.
Really does seem like it's laying the groundwork for Dooku and Sidious to eventually reprogram the clones for Order 66. When Dooku figures out that the Senator is lying, he immediately ignites his lightsaber, once again turning to violence first, just like in the last episode. Then we see that the rebels are using battle droids, just like they would years later as the Confederacy. This also explains why the Jedi couldn't sense their attackers. It's actually one of the few advantages of using battle droids versus Jedi. So these rebels are slowly getting to Dooku because they're showing him how the disenfranchised people of the galaxy actually see the Jedi. This guard calls the Jedi puppets of the Senate, and later this guy even says,
Jedi are lapdogs of the Senate. Their bidding always comes first. Jedi claim peace. but mostly keep law and order for the rich.
And they also say that this senator grew rich and powerful from his seat on Coruscant, which is a subtle way of showing how the Outer Rim worlds like Raxus are coming to resent being controlled by the core worlds, laying the groundwork for this planet's secession and the Confederacy of Independent Systems. And Mace Windu just can't understand why anyone would act outside of the law.
Why didn't you take this to the proper authorities?
But Dooku hears the disenfranchised and he empathizes.
Your ideology, while faulty, does have its points.
It's also very cool that Dooku is forming a friendship with the people on this planet, the same people that he will later convince to secede from the Republic and join the Confederacy of Independent Systems. And just before they leave, Dooku asks Mace Windu a question that is really at the core of his fall.
Do you think the Jedi will truly keep peace if they continue to take everything the Senate says as law?
And remember, at this point, Palpatine isn't even in control of the Senate. It's just a very large, ineffective governing body that Palpatine takes advantage of. Next, we go to a Jedi funeral at the temple filled with cameos and Easter eggs. Here we see Plo Koon, the Jedi who brings Ahsoka into the Order, and this is Tara Sinub, a very old Jedi who teamed up with Ahsoka in the Clone Wars episode Lightsaber Lost.
I need one last favor from you.
Sure. Name it.
Pass on what you have learned.
And of course, years later, we would see his corpse in Fortress Inquisitorius in the show Obi-Wan Kenobi. And here is Jocasta Nu, Jedi Librarian. Now, the funeral is presided over by Council Member Kaya Mundi. And of course, we also see Yoda. I don't think we've actually ever seen a Jedi funeral in the temple before. And I thought it was really cool how they still cremate their dead, but just with like a giant-ass lightsaber. Master Amundi's words resonate with Dooku.
She was of the Force. It flowed with certainty through her.
Because now Dooku's starting to wonder, did the Jedi still actually serve the Force at all? At the end of the episode, Dooku gets passed over for a promotion in favor of Mace Windu, the goody two-shoes. And this is where we see just a bit of ego in Dooku's fall. His ego is bruised by being passed over, maybe because his family is literal royalty on planet Serrano. So all of this is set up for Dooku's final fall to the dark side in episode 4, The Sith Lord. We begin the episode in the Jedi archives, tying up a loose end from Attack of the Clones. Obi-Wan couldn't find Kamino on the star maps because, as this young whippersnapper pointed out,
because someone erased it from the archive memory.
I wonder whatever happened to that kid. But of course, Dooku covered his tracks by using the login of his best friend, Sifo Dyas, who at this point he had just had assassinated. That is why later he lists Sifo Dyas among his crimes. This episode takes place during different points of the Phantom Menace, and notice how there's just a bit of gray in his beard now. Nice touch. He talks to Jocasta Nu, who actually first appeared in a deleted scene from Attack of the Clones talking about Count Dooku.
He was one of the most brilliant Jedi I've had the privilege of knowing.
The temple is buzzing with news that Qui-Gon just encountered the first Sith Lord anybody's seen in 1,000 years. So this is just after he fought Maul on Tatooine and then told the council about it.
I do not believe the Sith could have returned without us knowing.
In fact, Qui-Gon's answer in the movie,
he was trained in the Jedi arts,
is the same he gives in this episode.
I encountered a highly skilled warrior, one obviously trained in the Jedi arts.
And that is Liam Neeson returning to voice older Qui-Gon Jinn. Anyways, it's telling that Jocasta Nu doesn't believe Qui-Gon.
Qui-Gon Jinn always had such an active imagination.
Because this speaks to the complacency of the Jedi Order. Now, we do get the impression that Yaddle believed Qui-Gon, though.
What's a Yaddle?
Right, so Yaddle was on the Jedi Council in The Phantom Menace, and she's a female who is the same species as Yoda. It was always kind of a big mystery what happened to Yaddle during The Phantom Menace, because she's on the council, but not at the funeral on Naboo. There was even some speculation whispered in the corridors of Coruscant that there was a scandal about her getting pregnant with Grogu.
Tired Yoda is. Resign he will.
Yaddle is actually voiced by Bryce Dallas Howard, who has directed some great episodes of The Mandalorian. And unlike Yoda, she talks forward.
But the wisdom of the council is to be cautious.
So I guess that's like just Yoda's quirky way of speaking and not native to his species. When Qui-Gon talks about Obi-Wan, Dooku says,
I should like to meet him someday.
Which he eventually does in Attack of the Clones.
I thought you were the leader here, Dooku.
Next, we see the aftermath of Qui-Gon's death. Now, this is the event that really pushes Dooku away from the Jedi Order and toward Darth Sidious.
Well, that doesn't make sense. He's mad at the Jedi, so he joins the guy who killed his Padawan. Stupid prequel movies.
Well, that's why he and Sidious have this argument.
You've gone too far, Qui-Gon Jinn. You allowed Maul to kill him.
Dooku blames the Jedi because they didn't listen to Qui-Gon's warning about the Sith. Instead of sending a dozen Jedi to help the people of Naboo, they were constrained by the rules of the Senate.
Go with the Queen to Naboo and discover the identity of this dark warrior.
So they only sent Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan, so you see it all ties together. And also, he does not blame Sidious for Qui-Gon's death. He blames Darth Maul.
Qui-Gon Jinn, You allowed Maul to kill him.
So to mourn Qui-Gon, Dooku goes to the Great Tree in the Jedi Temple. This tree is important for several reasons. When Yoda was training Dooku, he ordered Dooku to move the tree with the Force, and of course Dooku couldn't do that. So this was Yoda's way of teaching him that he didn't know everything. After Order 66, 2 branches of this tree were kept by Palpatine because the tree itself has a strong connection to the Force. And just after Return of the Jedi, Luke recaptured these branches and planted one of them on Yavin 4 outside the boyhood home of Poe Dameron.
Neat.
Also, Qui-Gon was born on Coruscant. I never knew that. In this hangar bay, we see another R4 and RA7 droid units just as Dooku flies off to the industrial area of Coruscant, the same place where he met Sidious in Attack of the Clones. The music here is incredible. Haunting. Ian McDiarmid returns to voice Palpatine, which is very cool.
You lost an apprentice, and so did I.
Now, back to Qui-Gon's death. Dooku has accepted that to dismantle this government, many Jedi will die, but he obviously hopes that he can sway some of the Jedi away in order to join his side. I don't think at this point he has any idea that Palpatine is planning on the Confederacy losing the war. Dooku probably wanted a new government with a second order of Jedi, made up of freethinkers like himself. This is why in Attack of the Clones, he says this about Qui-Gon.
I wish he were still alive. I could use his help right now.
A sentiment that he first expresses here.
He could have been a powerful ally.
And then Yaddle, like an idiot, just makes her presence known. Maybe this is because she also just left the Jedi Council, and maybe the Jedi Order itself because she believes they're ineffective.
I stepped down from my position on the council.
Like maybe if she reported Dooku, then no one would believe her. But mostly, I just think she's really confident that she can turn Dooku away from the dark side.
Not a great plan.
Sidious, however, knows exactly how to tempt people.
The Jedi blindly serve a corrupt Senate that fails the Republic it represents.
He's basically echoing the Rebels' words in the last episode, reaffirming to Dooku what he already believes. It's called confirmation bias, and it's dangerous. So then he fights Yaddle as Palpatine watches. There are parallels here to Revenge of the Sith and Return of the Jedi. In all of these fights, Palpatine pits a would-be apprentice against someone they must defeat, so he can use their anger to finally turn them to the dark side. And just like in Return of the Jedi, one of the people hides while someone else hunts them.
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme.
And then Dooku tries to crush Yaddle, and notice how she squirms in between this gap and the gate.
Clever girl.
When the gate rises up, it floods the room with light. Now notice how Palpatine even covers his eyes. All of this is symbolic of Dooku's fall, as the last light within him is extinguished. And his line,
I want only to bring peace and order to the galaxy,
is of course echoed by Anakin in Revenge of the Sith.
I have brought peace, freedom, justice, and security to my new empire.
With episode 5, the focus shifts back to Ahsoka Tano, who is Dooku's great Grand Padawan granddaughter. Now this first scene takes place shortly after the Clone Wars begins, and actually there's a little bit of a mistake here. Obi-Wan has long hair when the Clone Wars begin in Attack of the Clones, but then in the Clone Wars movie, Anakin meets Ahsoka, and in that movie, Obi-Wan has short hair. So in this training scene, Ahsoka is already Anakin's apprentice, but Obi-Wan is back to having long hair.
Maybe it's a wig.
Yes, maybe it's a wig. High five. There's another continuity error when we see that the master training her is Tara Sanu. Now this is the old Jedi that she worked with in the Clone Wars episode Lost Lightsaber.
Pardon me, Master Sanube?
What? Who?
When they meet in that episode, it seems like it's for the first time.
I don't know you, do I?
My name is Ahsoka Tano.
But maybe Master Sanub doesn't know her because he's trained like 1,000 Padawans over the years, and also he's very old, and Ahsoka is just being polite by reintroducing herself. I also love his lightsaber cane. Also in the room we see Master Deepa Billaba and her Padawan, Caleb Dune. Now, we saw Caleb escape Order 66 in the first episode of The Bad Batch, and he will eventually grow up to be the Jedi Kanan Jarrus who we see in Star Wars Rebels. Here's another potential continuity error though. When the two of them meet in Rebels, they don't know each other. Again, maybe to Ahsoka he was just some kid, but Kanan probably would have remembered this badass Jedi that impressed him so much when he was a youngling. And of course, we also see Yoda, Mace Windu, and the Jedi Master who recruited Ahsoka Tano into the Order, Plo Koon. Obi-Wan calls her performance
impressive,
a word that Anakin would use later in his life.
Impressive. Most impressive.
Now this takes place right after the Clone Wars movie, which explains why they're both so standoffish.
Thanks for coming, Master.
Anakin's first lesson to her is to think outside of the box, like he does. In fact, the Jedi training was literally placing Ahsoka inside of a box to fight droids. Again, we're seeing this lineage of these rebellious masters rubbing off on their Padawans. Dooku left the Order. Qui-Gon ignored the wishes of the Council. So did Obi-Wan. Anakin turned to the dark side, and Ahsoka left the Order altogether. So Anakin uses a Republic transport to take her to a hangar bay where her old friend Rex and the 501st are waiting for her. They set their blasters to stun, a setting we don't see very often, but was used in A New Hope.
There's one. Set for stun.
Now notice that they're all wearing very early model clone helmets because again, this is not long after the Battle of Geonosis. They also don't have any of the customizations and coloring that the Army will add later in the war. Also, Jesse's there.
Jesse really tagged you.
Sorry, Commander.
We love Jesse.
I wish that I was Jesse's friend.
Alright, so Anakin puts her through this rigorous training, which again is a callback to Eastern cinema. The point of this lesson is for Ahsoka to be able to read the minds of the clones, to sense when they are about to fire at her. Droids are easier because they're programmed, but living soldiers are more random, and this pays off. There's little details like here, where we can see her start to move before this blaster behind her goes off. And then we flash forward in time. They're in a ship hangar bay between missions, and she's obviously asked them for a sparring session when Anakin isn't even around. Now she has her signature 2 sabers, and the clone armor has been updated. And finally, we end with a scene that takes place during Order 66.
Let's hope all that training pays off.
Now, this is set in the last episode of Clone Wars Season 7, when Rex is pretending to take Ahsoka prisoner. In the episode, we don't see this conversation, we just see them walking into a hangar bay. Now remember, this is after Ahsoka removed Rex's chip, so the two of them had to escape Order 66 together. And in case you forgot, the training did pay off. Except in this scene, it's Rex shooting stun rays at his brothers. So let's move on to episode 6, which neatly bridges the Ahsoka that we see in Clone Wars to the one that we meet in Rebels. So this final episode is called Resolve, which has a couple meanings. It can refer to the resolve of the Rebels, but also resolve means an ending, like they're wrapping up the season, or that Ahsoka is wrapping up her time sitting on the bench. Now this story kind of seems like a condensed version of the audio novel Ahsoka. That novel details her hiding out under the name Ashla, saving someone from falling crates, battling a Sith Inquisitor, and joining Bail Organa's rebellion. But the events are just a little bit different. In fact, the novel also talks about her defeating Darth Maul on Mandalore, which is also covered in the Clone Wars series.
So is the book canon?
Well, the book was narrated by Ahsoka herself, Ashley Eckstein, so maybe it's more of like Ahsoka's journal and is kind of an unreliable narration. Anyways, in this episode, Ahsoka takes the name Ashla. That's the name of a moon that orbits Tython, that's a Jedi world. And Ashla is also another word for the light side of the Force. Not a great pseudonym for a Jedi in hiding, but it is better than just keeping your last name.
She said Obi-Wan Kenobi. I wonder if she means old Obi-Wan Kenobi.
The episode begins at the funeral of Padme, which we saw in Revenge of the Sith, and when Padme was buried with a fake belly to keep up the illusion that she never gave birth. At the funeral, we see the founders of the rebellion, Mon Mothma and Bail Organa, and of course, Ahsoka hiding like Winter Soldier.
Limited power and no supervision.
Afterwards, Bail catches up to her and says,
"There's nothing you could have done for either of them."
Who's she talking about there?
Padme and Anakin. See, she thought that Anakin died during Order 66 and didn't find out he was Vader until Star Wars Rebels.
Ahsoka.
Anakin.
Also, I don't think Bail Organa ever found out that Anakin turned to the dark side and became Darth Vader. If he did, he probably would have told his old pal Obi-Wan that his former apprentice was running around the galaxy killing Force-sensitive people, instead of Obi-Wan finding out like this.
I'm sorry, Anakin.
Now the two of them are on the same walkways that Padme and Anakin walk down in Attack of the Clones, where Ahsoka says that she's tired of fighting. Now her friend Rex at this point is just about to continue his good fight, as we see in the Bad Batch.
I spent my life defending the Republic. Can't stop now.
But at some point, he also retires to hang out with his fellow clones on an old walker. Bail tries to appeal to her sense of duty to fight the Empire, and remember that he helped found the rebellion with Mon Mothma in one of my all-time favorite deleted Star Wars scenes.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
Sorry, that's a scene that should have been deleted. I meant this one.
We cannot let 1,000 years of democracy disappear without a fight.
She turns down Bail's offer and flies off with Rex in a BTL starfighter, the precursor to the Y-Wings we saw in A New Hope. You know, the worthless ones that always explode. Then we go to months or a year later and Ahsoka is back where she started, in a poor country village. In this village we see Twi'leks and the same loader droids that appeared in episode 2 of this series. Also notice that Ahsoka is wearing very similar overalls to what she was wearing when she first left the Jedi Order back in Clone Wars Season 7 Episode 5. Now the village can't keep up with the Imperial quotas and we get a kind of political discussion that's normally reserved for Andor.
In the beginning, you all welcomed the Empire.
not as warmly as you.
Now remember that when Palpatine ended the Clone Wars, he was a hero, and he claimed that he was forming the Empire to keep people safe.
For a safe and secure society.
And we do see this sentiment echoed years later in the show Andor.
The Emperor's primary charge is to protect us.
Palpatine also remains in power by using the rebels as scapegoats to stoke people's fears. And you can tell this guy is an Imperial loyalist because of the way he speaks to this droid.
Hey droid, finish up.
Anytime someone just calls a droid, they're bad. When they give them a nickname, they're good. So this idiot blabs her mouth about her being a Jedi, the brother overhears, and then drops a knowing.
May the Force be with you.
So when they return, she sees that a Sith Inquisitor, oh, by the way, this Sith Inquisitor looks way more awesome than any other Inquisitor we have seen so far. Got the bird skull mask, a red cloak with an Imperial crest, and he's voiced by the toughest screw that ever did a turn in Shawshank, Clancy Brown. This Inquisitor has destroyed the village and probably slaughtered its people just to get to Ahsoka. And then we get this epic showdown. Again, like something straight out of a samurai movie. This brings to mind many Kurosawa classics like Harakiri, Yojimbo, The Seven Samurai, and hell, while we're on the subject, Ahsoka's last scene in the Clone Wars was also a direct homage to the ending of Last Samurai. This Inquisitor has no idea what he stepped into. Ahsoka took down Darth Maul, and I also like how this series finale fits together with Dooku's stories. We see that Dooku was turned to the dark side in part because of a corrupt government, and it takes another corrupt government, the Empire, to convince Ahsoka to rejoin the fight. The moment she arrives at the farm even calls back to Luke Skywalker's call to adventure when his family's home was destroyed by stormtroopers. But unlike in Dooku's time, this event actually stops corruption from spreading. Instead, people join the fight against the Empire, and Ahsoka officially joins Bail Organa's rebellion. In Star Wars Rebels, we see that she becomes a rebel operative named Fulcrum who joins together various rebel cells. So what did you think of the series? Who do you think should be in the next season of Tales of the Jedi? Let me know in the comments below or at me on Twitter. And if it's your first time here, please subscribe, smash that bell for alerts. For ScreenCrush, I'm Ryan Airy.